3, 2, 1. Hey guys, welcome back to the Foam for Ad podcast. Tyler and Sam, this week we're talking all about anions. This podcast is coming out on Wednesday. We're going to start doing a midweek podcast. So maybe you'll get the blog on like Friday, like the weekend era. And then once we get into the week, the podcast will come out midweek. So Sam did this series where he started off with cations, and now we're doing anions, and he just does like a full detailed review on like everything you would ever want to know about these electrolytes, about these ions. And it's really, really interesting because as you go through it, some of the ones that maybe we don't think about that much, like phosphate, once you get in and start looking at how important they are and how, rarely is it just one electrolyte that's out of place. It's not like, oh, wow, just this one is crazy high or crazy low and nothing else is playing together. They all kind of talk to each other in a way. And when you're replacing them, you also have to know like which ones are going to affect the others when you're replacing them. And so I thought you did a great job of encompassing like everything cations and anions specifically for EMS providers. And so for this podcast, I thought we could just go down those and talk about each one that you listed and just kind of elaborate on that. And if you guys want that detailed look at it, just go check out the actual blog. But we're going to talk about the high points of most of those.
Yeah, so this was interesting timing for this one. While I was in the middle of writing this one, the basics trial came out. So maybe the one I started off with was chloride. And one of the biggest things with chloride is that it has a huge impact on your acid-base balance. And so anybody who's familiar with this concept of, chloride does this or chloride does that, is probably familiar with, the bashing that goes on with normal saline, because your body has a natural gap between your sodium and your chloride. Like the sodium is like, average of about 140. Everything is in milliequivalents per liter for these. And so it's like 140. And then the average for the chloride is like 100. So it's like a 40 milliequivalent gap between the two. But then when you look at normal saline, this is the reason people say like, it gives you, it's acidic because there's a lot of chloride in it. The chloride will make things more acidic. And the other thing that we look at, that difference that I mentioned, is the difference between the sodium and the chloride is called your strong ion difference. And in our bodies, we have this inherent difference between them, but sodium doesn't have, the sodium chloride, normal saline, doesn't have any difference between them. So it's 154 of one and 154 of the other. And so when you put that into the body, a general rule is that the body, it's kind of like that thing, you are what you eat. It's kind of like, the patient kind of is what you put into them. So everything will start to equal out, and the sodium and the chloride, they'll get closer together, and they'll develop this thing called a hyperchloremic acidosis. And essentially the problem with that is that it leaves less room for bicarbonate. I talk in the blog about how you kind of got these maxed out columns for positive charges and negative charges. And if you add a bunch of stuff to the negative charge side, everything is very strong over there, meaning that it can't really be broken down except for pretty much one thing, which is bicarbonate. And so as you add things into this stack, it reminds me of the Monroe-Kelly doctrine, where it's like, there's some things that it's almost like the strong ions be like the brain tissue that can't leave the brain, right? And everything else can kind of shift around. Well, those strong ions are, they can't really leave. They're just there. But the bicarbonate can buffer, it can go out. And so by adding strong ions like chloride to that stack over on the anion side, you can get bicarbonate to leave, and then your bicarb is low, and you got this acidosis that's kind of hard to come back from. And so this basics trial came out, and you took a look at that. Maybe we can talk about that for a second. So just to kind of prep you guys on this one. So this was a double-blinded, randomized control trial, multi-center, went on for quite a while. The N was large. How many people? 5,000? Am I under
10,500?
Something like that. Yeah. So over 5,000 people in there. And their primary endpoint was mortality at 90 days. And so maybe we can just talk about that a little bit. So you read through this. What were your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it was interesting. They looked at normal saline versus plasma light, a balanced crystalloid. I would have liked them to look at lactated ringers, but it was in Brazil, and maybe that's just the balanced crystalloid that they use out there. Mm-hmm. And they looked at or I should say, they had just blinded 500 ml bags, which is really well done, and they blinded it pretty well. They gave them either
Mhm.
normal saline, 0.9% saline, or they gave them this plasmolite, and they looked at that mortality at 90 days, which Josh Farkas does a really good podcast on why mortality, like ICU mortality, is kind of a poor endpoint, but sometimes I think it can be valuable. I think it was really interesting because the secondary outpoints or secondary outcomes were like dialysis and like days on the ventilator. And there really was no like statistical difference in that either. There was one that question that possibly they had worse outcomes. There was a statistical difference in patients who had a head injury or some sort of TBI and then received the balanced solution. And that's probably just the tonicity difference of not having the saline. I think most people would agree with that. But yeah,
Yeah.
there was no difference between the two. And I think listening to the MCRIT podcast that just came out, he had Rory Spiegel and Josh Farkas and Weingart were on there. And I agree with their conclusion that it probably depends more on how much fluid you get as opposed to what fluid you get. I do believe that there is a very specific like subset of patients that this does matter on. And I think of like the patient that you go in and they have like an elevated anion gap from beta hydroxybutyrate, like a DKA patient, and you're watching their anion gap, you're giving them insulin, you're trying to get that anion gap back to normal. And you're also looking at things like, your bicarb. And if you're giving somebody a solution that has a lot of chloride in it, that's going to increase, and it's going to take a while for that bicarb to come back to normal because of electrical neutrality. And you point that out great in your blog that you have to have an equal amount of cations and anions. Like those have to be in perfect equilibrium with each other to maintain electrical neutrality. So when you start adding in chloride, and then you think about the ketones that are elevating the anion gap, like you said, the bicarb is the thing that buffers out. It shrinks to allow that electrical neutrality because, as you've pointed out, we have everything in our body we need to create bicarb when we need to do it. And so the kidneys synthesizing that and really playing a key role in making that happen. If you have renal failure, well, then maybe there may be some benefit to supplementing that with bicarb, with the Bicarb ICU trial. But still, that was kind of a negative trial as well. So the certain subset of patients where you're watching those things, and maybe there's certain dialysis parameters that are reliant on those things. I think that probably matters. And if there's really no difference between the two, why not go with the more balanced crystalloid as opposed to, or I should say, as well as like it's got potassium in it, which is something that we know can drop when you're giving insulin. So I think that there's benefit in certain subsets, but if you look at all comers in the ICU, I think that you're probably going to find this in any repeat studies that there's really not a big difference unless you're getting like truckloads of volume.
Yeah, when I was looking at, so yeah, I agree with all those points. And I don't know, like in emergency medicine and like the critical care patients that we see, this wasn't the exact trial design. I think for what they did, it was designed very well. And I think they did the best that they could when you're looking at all comers. But when you're looking at all comers, a lot of these patients, a very large portion of them went to like elective surgery, and not a ton of them were these intubated patients. Like the subset that I would have wanted to see, which I don't think I wasn't not faulting them for anything, because clearly they wanted to see like on a very large scale all comers. Does this make a huge difference? And doing the best good, doing the most amount of good for the largest amount of people, does it really matter? And there's no statistical difference. But the people that I want to see is like that patient that's has a really bad metabolic acidosis. I want to see the patient who, a little bit of a bicarb, or, they're having trouble ventilating. And so this difference in bicarb is actually going to make a difference in CO2 elimination. And that contributes to more acidosis. And they do, start to have this very bad hyperchloremic acidosis. And they looked at the amount of fluid that was given in there. And it was higher on the first few days, but you can see that those more critical patients kind of tapered out at the beginning when you look at it. And then there was also a little bit of stuff that they couldn't control as well, because a certain portion of it was blinded solution, but they also include in there a graph where kind of the longer the patient is at the hospital, they're going to surgery, or so they couldn't control that. Those were unblinded fluids during surgery. Um, and then there was certain other times when, the patients in or initial care in the emergency room, unblinded fluids, and so I think it was like I looked at this graph on day 7. It was like 50% unblinded fluids to blinded fluids, and so I don't know. I don't think it's the exact when we talk about these very sick metabolic patients. I don't think it like the trial wasn't designed to do that, so it didn't give us a real good look at those very sick patients where small things like that, and I don't want to call it small. I mean, a metabolic acidosis is a big deal, especially when you're talking about patients on pressors and metabolic issues and ventilatory issues. Like, I would be very interested to see a subgroup analysis that zooms in on those patients quite a bit. Sick metabolic patients, intubated, pressors, needing blood, like all these different things, the sick transfers that we generally think about. That would be a very interesting trial to me, or subgroup analysis in that. But I can tell you, because this was kind of an all comers type of a deal, it didn't change the way that I wrote the blog at all. I noted that in there, and I do agree with you with the endpoints as well.
Yeah, even if you did like super sick patients, like there's so many other variables that affect 90-day
Mhm.
mortality other than fluid, and like you could say we're going to
Yeah.
compare 20 gauge catheters versus 18 gauge catheters in the ICU. We're going to look at 90-day mortality, and you may find something, but when you're looking at 90-day mortality, there's just so many variables. And most patients who are
Mhm.
very sick are going to probably die no matter what. And, there's probably a scale where you have the really
Yeah.
sick, the patients that are going to get better. And in reality, not that I'm deterministic, but there's probably not much that's going to change that. And so I think the reason we liked the argument and the results from like the smart IC or the smart trial and like the salty D trial was because it checked like the physiological boxes in our head that make sense.
Mhm.
Even though you could argue that those studies were not done that well, and there was really a small difference in mortality, everybody was just like, okay, that's all we need to know. Checks the physiological boxes, and
Mhm.
it's interesting because we were talking about this at work the other day. Sometimes the physiology does not match what you find in a study. And that can be a
Mhm.
real brain ninja because you think of like that study that came out that showed that it was looking at cardiac arrest IV versus IO and showing that IV was better than
Mhm.
IO. And you're like, okay, like the epi's getting in the body. What in the heck is the difference between the two? And it's interesting because that's when like your physiological understanding of something and then the statistical analysis like don't match up. So when we have something where they do match up, that hits us a little closer and we're like, okay, we have an easier time accepting that. When
Mhm.
they don't match up, we're like, okay, there's something wrong with this, or maybe we need to zero in on a subset. But when you zero in on a subset like that, you're not going to get the end that you saw with the basics trial. And so you have to look at
Mhm.
it at its face value. A very pragmatic approach, looking at all comers, is the routine use of normal saline going to increase mortality? And this obviously showed that it doesn't. But your blog does a great job of pointing out why that argument is there in those physiological boxes. And I think that's a really important aspect as well.
Yeah, there's definitely always going to be some unmeasured variables when you have a lot of unmeasured variables, because you don't want to have too many variables, because then your study's diluted. And if you just look at one and then your endpoint is really far out, like a 90-day mortality, man, that's really distal to the effects of some of the treatments that the patients receive. So I don't know. Like I said, I'd like to see some subgroup analysis and a very close in proximity time frame to a different probably endpoint than mortality. But I don't know what else it would tell us. But I do agree with you. It does scratch a certain part of my brain that I kind of have an itch in, when it's like the physiologic stuff does make more sense. Like, oh, the lactated ringers, those have, the sodium's very close and the potassium is normal and the chloride's very close. It has some calcium in there. This, sodium lactate can turn into bicarbonate in the liver and it doesn't change your base excess. That those checking those boxes, it seems to always make more sense. But then, you do have something like this, like you said, very pragmatic, that says, Well, when you look at all comers, though, 90 days, it doesn't make a difference in who's dead and who's not. But I don't know. Everybody's kind of got to decide for themselves on what they want to do. I can tell you this doesn't change the way that I think about balanced fluids, and it didn't change the way that I wrote the blog either.
Cool. Well, let's move on to bicarb, another anion, otherwise known as a CO2 if you're looking at your chem panel. So
Mhm.
why don't they just call it bicarb? Why is it called CO2 on the chem panel? Have you figured that out yet?
I think that well, so most CO2 is transported as bicarb, and so I don't know. I think they just call it that. But I don't think that they should do that, but now I think it would screw everybody up. Like it's been that way for so long. So I don't know. It's just, one can be transferred to another and one can be transported as another, because all you need to go back into and out of bicarbonate with CO2 is just water, and obviously there's a ton of water around everywhere. So uh, I don't know.
So
The
if my
hydrogen.
bicarb is if I look at my CO2 on my chem panel is 18, I definitely need to slow down my ventilation, right?
Yeah, yeah. But that happens like all the time. People say
Right.
like, "Oh, this is a CO2," and they're like, "Wow, this patient's in a crazy respiratory alkalosis," because it does. It says CO2 on your metabolic panel. And if somebody's just used to looking at ABGs, or they're not used to that nomenclature, I guess that can really screw somebody up. So yeah, that was the first point that I made about the bicarbonate, was just, yeah, note that on your chem panel it's going to be called CO2. So, but you'll notice there should always be reference ranges next to them. And so if you see the reference range is, whatever your institution, 22 to 26, and it's not 35 to 45, like that reference range should tell you something about that bicarbonate. But yeah, with the bicarb, I mean, it was pretty much very related to the chloride that we talked about, in that it's kind of the free agent where it can move in and out of that anion stack. And the body does have all the things that it needs to create that bicarbonate. And so most of the time, it doesn't really need to get replaced. But there are some circumstances, like you can lose a ton of bicarbonate in stools. So people have like really bad diarrhea, constant diarrhea. You can lose bicarbonate there. Basically, any way you're excreting things out of the body, and then urination as well. Kidneys can stop making it and or causing it to be created in the body. And if you get things that affect your nephrons as well, like a big board test question thing is acute tubular necrosis. And so when you have the tubules that they start getting diseased or hardened or diseased in some other way, they don't reabsorb bicarbonate very well. And so the patients end up peeing it out. And so you can either pee it out, poop it out, or you can stop making it. And those are some instances where the replacement might make sense, because that's a situation where it probably won't come back to normal on its own if the body is continuously just depleting itself of that bicarbonate.
Yeah, I always hear bicarb referred to as the buffer, and people refer
Mhm.
to it as a buffer because they say it buffers out acid. But I think of it like buffering the electrical neutrality on the anion side. It can shrink and grow. And if you've ever seen a patient with DKA who has an elevated anion gap, and you go in and their bicarbs, reduced, let's just say it's like 16 or something, 10, as you fix that acidosis, you have to wonder why the bicarb just magically comes right back to normal, even if you don't give bicarb.
Mhm.
And wrapping your head around that concept makes sense. And then when you think about the patient with DKA who has shrunk their bicarb to make room for that beta hydroxybutyrate, giving them bicarb may temporarily increase your pH because you're increasing the sodium. But you have to think about the body tightly regulates sodium, and it's not going to stay elevated. So that tonicity is going to level out. You're going to be right back where you were. And I always explain it like the body going, dude, I just broke down the bicarb. Why are you giving me more bicarb? Like, focus your attention on
Mhm.
getting rid of the beta hydroxybutyrate. And we did that whole podcast called Don't Stop the Insulin, addressing that specifically.
Mhm.
But I think of it as buffering out the anion side as opposed to like buffering out acids.
Yeah. So the other one that we did was, so I want to do, let's quickly hit just a couple points on phosphate, and then I want to wrap up with albumin. So the whole phosphate thing was essentially, this isn't something you routinely hear about, but the thing that I brought out in the blog was that with the phosphate, there's some really important stuff in the body that it helps make. Like some of our most important substances in the body are made with phosphates. If you guys remember the oxyhemoglobin desaturation curve one that we did, it has a huge role in what's called 2,3-DPG, which is 2,3-diphospho, so two phosphates, and then glycerate, right? So 2,3 DPG, that P in there is, yeah, phosphate. So if you don't have enough phosphate around, you can't make that. And then the other thing that it helps out with is ADP and ATP. So adenosine diphosphate or adenosine triphosphate. And so when you have these really bad, depleted levels of phosphate, that can really start to affect, that's going to affect oxygen delivery. And it's also, I mean, to think of anything bad that can happen in an organ system when it doesn't have enough energy. And that's your hypophosphatemia right there, because it's literally just not making enough ADP, ATP, and then you can't release energy. And so think about, in the heart, that would mean that you're not pumping as strong and fast. In the brain, you're not, electrical signals are not getting, sent as fast, or just anything that you can think of. The vascular portion of the cardiovascular system, the muscles don't have the strength to contract, and so altered mental status, shock, vasoplegia, like all these different things essentially happen with this phosphate.
Yeah, it's interesting because the majority of phosphate is actually stored inside the cell. And so things that cause potassium to leak out can also cause phosphate to leak out. And so you'll see phosphate levels checked on, I keep bringing up DKA because it's by far my favorite illness to discuss, because I feel like it's the one that challenges your brain the most because there's so many things changing. But things that cause potassium to leak out, like an acidosis and like a hydrogen exchange, can also cause that phosphate to leak out as well. And so I was explaining that if you see a normal phosphate level or a normal potassium level in a DKA patient, you have to question whether you still have that reserve in the cell and you're seeing the serum, or whether what you're seeing in the serum is total body and it's already made its way out of the cell. And then when you're replacing phosphate, I was reading if you put too much in, or you give them too much, or you give it too fast, it can actually bind to the calcium as well. And you address that really well in the blog.
Yeah, if there's adequate levels of, because your regulatory and counter-regulatory hormones are your parathyroid and your calcitonin. And so as long as your thyroid and your parathyroid work, when they see a bunch of phosphate, they're going to allow you to essentially make bones, and hard areas where you don't want them, that's more of a long-term thing. And so short-term, yeah, the phosphate can bind with the calcium, because that's essentially what's going to go and make bones. Or if you have elevated levels of phosphate long term, and that calcium, you can get arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries and stuff like that, hypertension, and just a bunch of long term things we don't generally think about. But in the short term, yeah, it can lead to some hypocalcemia, which we addressed in the last thing. So yeah, that's just a little bit about phosphate. Not something that we think about really too often, but when it's low, obviously it can cause huge problems, just global system energy lack problems. But yeah, so the last thing was just the albumin. And Jake Good did a really good blog on this a while ago, and we both used the same example of somebody who has an albumin problem. So albumin is one of our plasma proteins. It's made by our liver. And one of the things that it does is that it soaks up a bunch of the drugs that we give. So when you hear somebody say this drug is really highly plasma protein bound, there are different plasma proteins, but a majority of the time they're talking about albumin. So the classic example of one of these issues is that this is a board exam a question again, the classic albumin scenario is that you have an elderly individual and they're going to go in for elective surgery, and they take warfarin, right? And so you just did that podcast on warfarin, 97% plasma protein bound, which means that, and that's an albumin one. So albumin soaks up 97% of that drug, and then 3% of it is floating around, and that's what's causing your blood to become thin. And so If the patient's on another highly plasma protein bound medication, I think the example in the blog I use is phenytoin. It was like 90% plasma protein bound. The classic example goes, okay, this person's going in for elective surgery, and they say, okay, hey, stop taking your warfarin 2 weeks before surgery because we don't want you to bleed out. And so the patient follows the orders, they stop taking the warfarin, and then once all that warfarin is gone from the system and it's not attached to the albumin anymore, that albumin is just going to soak up whatever else is sitting around. So if they have like phenytoin in there, it's going to soak up a bunch of that phenytoin, leaving very little amount of that drug to be free to cause these effects in the system, namely, raising the threshold for them having a seizure. So their seizure threshold dumps down into the garbage because they don't have any free drug left because the albumin soaked it up. Those open spots that were occupied by warfarin now soak up the phenytoin, and then they have a seizure. And so that can happen with us as well if you give a medication. So this is where the warning comes from with um, opioids and benzodiazepines. You give somebody, a highly, fentanyl or something, and then when you give them a little bit of Versed, it goes a really long ways because not only does it kick some of the fentanyl off the albumin, but it also leaves more of the Versed in the serum as well. And so they call that a synergistic effect. 1+1 = 3, because you have to take into account what's coming on and off the plasma proteins. And so that's a really cool effect. And I gave another example in the blog of two medications that they don't seem very related, but if they're both bound to plasma protein, giving one is like giving an intrinsic bolus of another. And so that can get some people in trouble if they don't realize that their dosing is going to go a lot longer, or have a much heavier hit than they anticipated.
Yeah, when I think of albumin, I think of two things. I think of the plasma protein, like you talked about, the binding. And then the other thing is I think about the oncotic pressure, because that's the primary source of oncotic pressure. It's the most prevalent protein in the human body. And so what's interesting is, so my grandma had cirrhosis of the liver and she ended up dying from that. And I remember visiting her in the hospital, and all of her fluid had third spaced, and she was constantly getting like pleural effusions, pericardial effusions. And I remember the doctor explaining to me the reason this is happening is because her liver is not making albumin, and albumin is what keeps all of that fluid inside the vessel. And so if you don't have that albumin, it's going to leak out. And yeah, you can give people albumin, but that's only going to last so long. You need the ability to create it, and you have to have like good nutrition. You got to be able to synthesize it inside the liver. But I always think about that because that's another cause of pulmonary edema that may not be on your radar. We always think about the hydrostatic pulmonary edema. So like the left ventricle's not functioning properly, everything's backing up, and you're actually having an increase in hydrostatic pressure. But you could have everything working fine and then have a decrease in oncotic pressure, and that fluid's just going to come right out of those out of the vasculature. And to get it back in, you got to give them albumin, but you obviously meet diminishing returns. You can't just put somebody on a lifetime infusion of albumin. So that's the other aspect of it that I think about. And then in addition to that, just something that's interesting is like how long we've been able to actually measure albumin. Because if you look at like the science of ion chromatography, and we were just talking about this, I was saying it was interesting because I'm reading about the Manhattan Project right now in school. I actually have to write a paper on it today. And like that period of like in the 1940s is really where they started looking at trying to differentiate different parts of the ions. And I heard a really cool explanation. They said, if you've ever seen like, when you draw like a black pen on a white piece of paper, and then maybe it smears, it get a little water on it, and you see like that gradient, what you're doing is that's like the simplest form of chromatography. You're taking a liquid and you're separating it into its parts. And the ion chromatography is looking at how they react to a certain resin. So they're looking at how they react to, positives and negatives and how they can separate them. And so they, if I imagine like they probably could separate positive versus negatives, and they could see that they equal each other, but then trying to like differentiate, well, what is the positives made up of? And then they started being able to separate sodium. Okay, that seems like a lot of it is sodium. But what's interesting is that the anion gap that we look at is really predicated on an anion or an albumin of around 4, like a normal albumin. And so if you start changing the albumin, that can change what your normal anion gap is. And if you've looked at different references, you may wonder why some anion gaps are way higher. Some of them are lower for normal values. And a lot of that is because of correcting for that anion gap, or looking at the potassium, like what things are you actually measuring. And you talked about this in your blog, how you can have a falsely elevated or falsely decreased anion gap depending on what the albumin is. And Josh Farkas from PalmCrit did a really good blog, like looking at the history. And his thing was like saying it's not important to correct for albumin, and that a lot of those studies that said it was like predicated on really weird mathematical equations that don't really equal out, or don't, it's hard to tease out. But I think it still pays to like look at that, because that could drastically change it of what your normal anion gap would be.
Yeah, if the albumin's super low, you've taken something out of that stack. And so let's say the albumin's really low, and the patient gets one of those gold mark items that is one of those, rogue, maybe foreignish ions, and it elevates a bunch. If the albumin wasn't there in the first place to take up some of that stack, then you're not going to see that elevated anion gap, because part of it is the albumin. It's if you don't have the albumin, you're leaving more room for other stuff. It visualizing that stack just really helps. So make sure you guys check that out. And there's a good point about the serum osmolality. The weird thing that I always wondered about was why isn't the albumin, if it contributes so much to this pull of fluids, why isn't it included in the serum osmolality? Because it's just sodium, glucose, and blood urea nitrogen, but it's the colloid oncotic pressure. And so it's larger than those. So it's kind of counted differently. And the one reference that I found said that, it counted for 80% of those like larger protein pulls, those larger, pieces in the blood, in the serum. And so it's measured a little bit differently. So it's not included on that regular thing, because that's one of the things that when I teach a class on lab values, I'm like, okay, what do you guys think is, included in the serum osmolality? And one of the first things a lot of people say is albumin, but it's not part of the traditional measurement because it's a colloid. And so it's a little bit larger. So it's measured a little bit differently, but it still contributes a ton to that pull. So that's why you see those patients get ascites and stuff like that if they have liver failure and just like third spacing fluid all over the place. And so it's super interesting. And it's not something that's traditionally taught, I don't think, in initial paramedic education about the plasma protein binding and how it affects pharmacology and fluid and stuff like that. But definitely one that you want to add to your repertoire when you start looking at lab values, for sure. So I think we hit on just about everything. So a lot more information and references inside the blog if you guys want to check that out. And this week, before we get out of here, I want to mention that we're running a sale for the refresher as well. So it comes with a couple reference cards, so the Vent in the Lab reference card, along with the Speakers Atlas as well, for the same price as the refresher course. So make sure you guys check that out. It's run until we started it today. Did we start it today?
I started yesterday, and it'll run till Sunday. What is that, the 5th, I think?
The 5th, something like that. Yeah. You guys will see it on the website, and you'll see the ad too. So
cool, man. Awesome. Great post.